Locked On Podcast Network presents Locked On Sports Today.
Paul and Klay Thompson are out. The Warriors are pivoting. So what's next in Golden State? Also, the Pelicans made a major upgrade. And what Bronny James did to get drafted by the Lakers is not uncommon. Just ask one of his teammates. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started.
I'm Peter Bukowski, starting your day with the can't miss stories and biggest debates in sports. You're Locked On Sports Today.
Searching all major sports. Found.
Let's start with the biggest story.
The Golden State Warriors are going to look very, very different in 2024, at least as we stand here today after the first few hours of the NBA's free agent opening. Kylan Mills from Locked On Warriors joins me now. And Kylan, Chris Paul is not only no longer a Warrior, he's already got a new team, according to reports. Right. And the reports that we have around Klay Thompson is that he will play somewhere else for the first time in his NBA career. What is this signal to you about this team?
This is an official changing of the guard in the Golden State Warriors. An era is officially over with Klay Thompson departing this organization. It's the big three, not the big two, bottom line. So the separation of Draymond Green, Steph Curry, and Klay Thompson has huge implications. It's something the fans have been going nuts about. As soon as free agency was looming, the reports came out that Klay Thompson and the Golden State Warriors conversations weren't going well. You saw him unfollow the team on Instagram. I immediately was like, I'm reading into this. I had heard from a number of sources, and I also just thought myself, like, feelings are hurt. There's something going on. He's trying to send a message, and that's exactly the case. It's an official changing of the guard and an era ending for the Golden State Warriors. Yes, they can still try to make a competitive team. They can still try to contend, but it's not the same. The big three are the core that brought 4 championships to the Golden State Warriors. Klay Thompson was drafted by the organization back in 2011. He's been a key cog for this organization for over a decade. So this is really huge. It's something a lot of fans are really sad about. I think it needs to happen. It makes sense for both sides, unfortunately, but it's still a sad day in Golden State Warriors land. And of course, so many are sad to see Klay Thompson move on.
Yeah, it was the Splash Brothers, not one Splash guy. Like they were the brothers. Yep. Like you need two to be brothers. Line. So you have to always have the Warriors in mind when there is a big fish to be, I don't know, fished, right? Like to be caught. And so is there in your mind something that makes sense for them for this all to lead to? Because you move on from Chris Paul. There's a money aspect to that. Klay Thompson obviously wanted to get paid like someone who's going to go down as one of the greatest players in franchise history. The Warriors were unwilling to do that. So what's next?
It's the $1 million question. I think immediately a lot of people thought Paul George would be the right fit because the big problem for the Golden State Warriors this past season was that there was no reliable secondary scorer. And it's so important with Steph Curry that you have someone who can be a number 2. You need someone to help space the floor. And at the end of the day, he needs help. And there was no one this past season who was able to step up because Klay Thompson is still an elite shooter, but he hasn't had the same consistency he had prior to 2 major injuries. So the big issue is who's going to step up? Is anyone on the current roster ready to step up? And the reality of that is no. Jonathan Kuminga is a young player who's come a long way, was a secondary scorer at times, but isn't ready to really bear that load over a course of 82 games. So now who can you bring in? And a lot of folks are looking at Paul George coming off a great season. He was still very healthy despite being 34 years old, one of the healthiest of his career, someone who can put up 20 plus per game. But then that falls apart as it comes out that he's not going to re-sign because the Warriors would have to execute a trade for him to come to the Golden State Warriors because of the cap space. It is limited. Even with Chris Paul and Klay Thompson being off the books, the money is limited. And with the Warriors' moves during this last draft, they now have to stay under the luxury tax apron. So just the money is very tight for the Warriors. So here's the conundrum. I was shocked to learn in the last 24 hours that the Warriors had conversations with the Chicago Bulls about possibly Zach LaVine coming to the organization in exchange for Andrew Wiggins. Chris Paul was also part of those discussions reportedly. But to me, I'm like, why not give it a shot? Zach LaVine, I still think can get back to 2021 Zach LaVine, where he was averaging 27 a game. Plus his shooting splits were incredible, almost 50, 40, 90 during that season. He's 29 years old. I personally would have been okay with rolling the dice in that situation, because what's the alternative at this point? Andrew Wiggins has not been able to play anywhere near the level of what he was at in 2022. He's a piece who's reportedly been shopped around. I don't know what kind of market there is, but to me, I'm like, hey, let's try a Zach LaVine for an Andrew Wiggins. And then Chris Paul, if you're going to end up cutting him anyway, throw him in the mix. Like, why not? At the end of the day, you're trying to get that salary off the books. That was shocking to me. I would have been okay with the Zach LaVine. Now you're looking at Brandon Ingram maybe being the next best option. Don't mind him, but this is another player, a little bit inconsistent at times, not great defensively, which has been another criticism of Zach LaVine. The Warriors' perimeter defending not been good the last two seasons since their 2022 title run. So some folks may be looking for a better defender, but at the end of the day, you need a reliable secondary scorer, and finding someone who's going to be a secondary scorer and a great defender, that's a big ask with the amount of money the Warriors have to spend. So Brandon Ingram may be the best option at this point. I would have been okay with Zach LaVine. He does have a little under $50 million in the last year of his contract that you would have to be paid. But at this point, the options are very limited for the Warriors. So they're now between a rock and a hard place, honestly.
Stay up to date all year on the Golden State Warriors by subscribing to Locked On Sports Today and Locked On Warriors on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Thanks for making Locked On Sports Today your first listen. Coming up, the Pelicans backcourt just got a lot better. Before we get to that, James Harden is returning to the Clippers. I love sports. I love them so much I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up a bet anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. The Brewers' hot bats are headed to every hitter's favorite park, Coors Field. FanDuel has the Brew Crew favored over the Rockies to win tonight. Milwaukee's money line minus 164. FanDuel also liked the total runs for the Brewers at 6.5, which feels like a home run, or should I say a grand slam. That's all they've been doing lately. Head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. If you're catching this episode after hearing your favorite Locked On show, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. James Harden is going to be sticking with the Clippers for now. He signed a 2-year, $70 million deal with LA. According to reports, Harden is an LA native and expressed his happiness when playing at home with the Clippers multiple times throughout the season. He helped lead the Clips to a solid season where they had the best record in the West in February. This move also comes at a time when the Clippers are uncertain if Paul George will remain in LA, although right now it looks like he will not. Speaking of Paul George, the Sixers are said to be favorites to land that superstar.
The cupboard is pretty bare with the free agents now. I mean, you see this flurry of activity. LeBron, who was kind of off the table anyway, but just kind of a talking point. LeBron's off the table. Jimmy Butler looks like he's kind of content in South Beach. And Paul George has been the apple of their eye, as you have been reporting for quite some time now. So, from what I'm hearing, and I trust I trust these folks. I think it's the 76ers to lose. So I do think that when free agency begins, I think Paul George is a 76. I don't know how long the process takes for them. They hope it doesn't take very long at all. But I think we may be gathering here, to talk about Paul George, Tyrese Maxey, and Joel Embiid, and, the triumvirate that they should be forming.
The Orlando Magic are adding Kentavious Caldwell-Pope as the Nuggets lose another key role player.
I don't think that the Magic should throw their money at one guy. They need multiple players. They need multiple high-end players. So I didn't think they should throw their money at one guy like Paul George. But I think that now, you can go after multiple players. So maybe Hartenstein's still in play. Again, like I've kind of mentioned, I'm looking for some wing help too. I think Gary Trent Jr. would be played. So you have 38, let's estimate $38 million in cap room left. You could go spend 25 of that on Isaiah Hartenstein if you want, and then you've got 13 left to spend on someone else. So there is still a lot to get to here. Now,
as I mentioned earlier, Chris Paul did not take long to find a new home. He joins Victor Wembanyama and the San Antonio Spurs. Paul did not have the best of years last year. He averaged 9 points per game, just a shade under 7 assists in 58 games played. He will now get to play with Greg Popovich, two of the old vets of the NBA. Over on the diamond, Wyatt Langford became the first Texas Ranger rookie to hit the cycle since 1985 as Texas dominated Baltimore.
Have yourself a freaking night. Wyatt Langford, the first Sunday night baseball cycle in history. A fantastic night of great offense for the Texas Rangers. In the year of our Lord 2024, I forgot that they had this in them. Just what an incredible night for Langford, the star of the show, hitting for the cycle, turning what would have normally been just a pretty casual, maybe 3-hit game with a double and a home run. But no, he takes it, and he takes it to the next level. The power, the speed, turning what should have been a routine single into a double, turning what was probably, for most people, a double into a triple, and then hitting the tarnation out of a baseball for that 3-run shot. What a night for Wyatt Langford, and what a night for the Rangers offense.
The Rockies and White Sox played the most interesting game of the day as it took 14 innings to decide the winner.
Ezekiel Tovar, who ends up delivering what would eventually be the game-winning run. You love to see Mr. Tovar stay hot. He's got 2 hits with an RBI in today's game. Did strike out 3 times, but he's hitting 284. Ryan McMahon playing scrappy today. He had a base hit, hitting 270 on the year. And Elias Diaz, nice to get Mr. Diaz back in the lineup. He had 4 at-bats today, comes around to score a run, had 2 base hits, hitting 307. And look, I know I've kind of beaten the trade deadline stuff to a pulp at this point, but, just nice to see him back in the lineup in general, whether it's going to be to boost his trade value or help the morale of this team, because Lord knows offensively, since Elias Diaz was placed on the injured list, it has been an absolute slog for this Rockies offense. So really nice to see Diaz get back in there and get a couple of base hits on his return to the diamond as well.
The New Orleans Pelicans made a big trade, and it did not involve Brandon Ingram. Locked On Pelicans host Jake Madison breaks down the Deonte Murray trade for the Pels.
Probably laughing at me because I was on a plane when this trade broke, and I'd kind of heard that something was coming, and I was like, of course it's going to happen, when I'm 36,000 feet up in the air, and it did. So I'm recording this like as soon as I can after that. Landed. Basically, first thing I'm doing is recording this show for you because the news is that big. And we're going to have a lot more next week on this too. We'll have a lot more on Yves Missi and Antonio Reeves and the Pelicans offseason plans because it's just getting started. But I want to say this. I've told you how something was coming. If you're an everydayer of Locked On Pelicans, this move should somewhat surprise you because it's cheaper than what we expected, and we'll get into that here. But I saw a lot of people panicking. And I was like, don't do that. The offseason is just underway. It's why I did yesterday's show talking about how David Griffin was like, we're not going to be an apron team. And a lot of people took that the really wrong way because they didn't understand it. We'll get more into the salary cap stuff here with all of that. But if you're an everydayer, or if you're not an everydayer, you should be one because you kind of understand a lot of what's going on here. So let's break down the trade. Dejounte Murray coming to New Orleans, going to the Atlanta Hawks. It's 3 players. Larry Nance Jr., Dyson Daniels, and EJ Liddell, along with 2 picks, the 2025 Lakers pick next season, and the worst of the Pelicans picks with theirs or the Bucks pick in 2027. So the Pelicans will have the better pick of those. This is a pretty good deal. Now, it's essentially 3 first-round picks for Dejounte Murray. Basically what they traded, the Atlanta Hawks traded to the Atlanta Hawks for him. Now, their own picks, those Hawks picks are valuable, so this is a net loss for them. But overall, they didn't really lose any picks, and for them, that's a good deal. But this is also a great trade for New Orleans because, 1, they had a big need at the point guard position, which Murray is expected to fill. And 2, they didn't have to part with Brandon Ingram. More on kind of what's next, Ingram, CJ McCollum, the salary cap in the next segment here. But this is overall a very, very good deal for New Orleans. any kind of trade we had talked about, and I was even on Locked On NBA with our Hawks host talking about this week, seemed like it would involve Brandon Ingram, Dejounte Murray, and then one of the centers for the Atlanta Hawks. And not in Okongwu or Capella, their two centers, aren't guys that I'm like exceedingly high on. If you got one, sure. I don't love Capella's contract, even if it's expiring. But this move to keep Brandon Ingram, knowing you can trade him later or even re-sign him, is a great piece of business. This is why the Pelicans believed in their plan, promoted Bryson Graham to the general manager position vacated by Trajan Langdon. This is why David Griffin, after the draft said the offseason has just started. Our roster doesn't need to be set. You don't need to get anything done on draft night. And that's why I said have some patience. That's why I also said I do think they're going to get expensive because this team's going into the luxury tax this year. There's almost no way of getting around it. So enough of the breakdown of the trade. This is a good deal for New Orleans. I don't doubt that at all. We'll miss Larry. We'll miss Dyson. We'll talk about them in a minute. But this is a good move by New Orleans that leaves all of the options open. If you're a Pelicans fan, you should be happy about this sort of thing. So let's look at Murray. How does he fit? Why did they make this trade? Why did they pick him over Trae Young? So one, I don't really think Trae Young was on the table. Murray was the guy that New Orleans has long coveted going back to the trade deadline where they tried to acquire him. I thought it would cost more than what they did. This is, again, a good piece of business for the Pelicans here. This was the guy they like, and I think it's partially because they envision him in the backcourt with CJ McCollum. Murray has good size at 6'5", can defend multiple positions. And even though his defense has gone down a little bit since he's been in Atlanta, this is a former All-Star who had a reputation as one of the better defensive guards in the league. He's also a very good rebounder too. More on that in the next segment.
Stay up to date all year on the New Orleans Pelicans by subscribing to Locked On Sports Today and Locked On Pelicans on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Coming up, Bronny James had leverage in where he would be picked in the second round, and that's not as rare as you think. Bronny James was selected by the Lakers in the second round of the NBA draft, and there were, of course, immediately all sorts of opinions as to why. As Locked On Lakers host Andy and Brian Kamenetsky point out, there are plenty of players who have done this, including a new teammate of Bronny's.
I think, he was drafted at an appropriate time in the draft. I think there are a lot of teams that didn't take him earlier. I'm not talking earlier like 31 or 26, but I think a lot of teams in the 40s or early 50s that might have taken a flyer on him didn't because they didn't want to piss off Rich Paul. I mean, I think that's part of it. Like, it's just not worth it. They had done this, they didn't want to risk their second round pick going to Australia for a year and all these other threats because it's not worth it. And you're like, did Bronny James have leverage in this process that second round picks typically don't have to try to guide his way to a preferred destination? Yes, of course he did. Is what Bronny James did in broad terms unusual? It is not. When you get into the second round, particularly, it is very common for agents, to try to game the setup.
That's how Austin Reeves ended up a Laker.
Correct. To say, do not draft me, try to avoid it, try to get your guy into free agency, try to avoid certain outcomes, especially when you're going to be drafted in the second round. You want the outcome that's going to be best for you. And, in many ways, I know many people are deeply cynical about this, and we'll talk about it. There are a lot of advantages to Bronny being in LA versus, say, Washington.
Every player in the second round would do this if they could. Even players at the end of the NFL draft who have no recourse, they have no option. There is no, I'm threatening to go play in Australia, as Bronny's camp reportedly did. There is no, I'm going to go play for Olympiacos. I'm going to go play in London, in Europe. There is no version of that in the NFL. And even in the NFL, you hear from players, from agents, hey, we tell teams, don't pick us. We don't want to get drafted. Or even if they don't tell teams that, that's how they feel. If they had some leverage to do that, they would want to do that. And so in the NBA, these players, they have more leverage. When you're drafting an overseas player, he could say, I'm just not going to come over if you draft me. They have leverage. It's not just that it's LeBron James' son. He could, and be totally financially fine, go play in Australia. He could just say, I'm going to become an accountant. I'm going to go just be a TikToker forever. I don't need basketball. If you draft me, I'm not showing up. He could do that too. This part of it is not weird. And I would just say, I think the story that those two could potentially play together is incredibly cool. There's plenty of reasons to be cynical. There's plenty of jokes to be made. But as Andy and I talked about last week, from a father-son standpoint, especially speaking as a father, it's a very cool story. And finally, the home run derby is too fast, or so Major League Baseball thinks, as they tweak the rules ahead of this year's contest. Not next year's, this year's. Players have expressed concern over the derby moving too fast in the past, and will get a change that limits the total pitches in a round. Each timed round will only consist of 40 pitches, like the three-point contest for the NBA All-Star Week that limits the amount of shots you take. You don't just get to put up shots forever until you hit all the threes you want. So efficiency will be key. This means the pitcher is going to be key too. If you're catching this episode after hearing your favorite Locked On show, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Also, if you're a new subscriber to Locked On Sports Today, we're here with you with the biggest stories in sports every day. Coming up on the next Locked On Sports Today, will Paul George be a Sixer by the end of the day? So at least until tomorrow, stay locked on sports today.
Locked On Podcast Network presents Locked On Sports Today.
For more episodes of Locked On Sports Today, go to our video on demand. Click on sports at the top of your screen. There, you'll find past episodes of Locked On Sports Today, plus other Locked On shows on demand.